I want to just take a minute to summarize our 5 methods for solving quadratic equations. Um, so we've already talked about graphing, square root property, and factoring with the zero product property. So the first 3 things should already be filled into your chart. If you don't have those 3 things, then you can just pause this and take the time you need to copy it down. The fourth thing is completing the square and the square root property. So I've given you an example of what that looks like. X squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0. So that's our standard form for an equation. Remember that you move the constant to the other side. So in this case, I'm subtracting 3 to both sides. And I set it up so I have x squared plus 4x plus I set it up for my blank. And whatever I add to one side, I have to add to the other side. So then what I do next is to get what fills in the blank, you take half the middle term, which is 2, and you square it, which is 4. So I put a 4 here, which means this is a 4. And then now I have completed the square. So remember, we talked about this in class. So this would be x plus 2 quantity squared, whatever it was when you took half of it. Negative 3 plus 4 is 1, so we get a 1 here. And then you actually use method 2, the square root property. Notice it looks just like this example here. So what I would do next is I would square root both sides. I would get plus or minus the square root of 1, which is 1, and then subtract 2. So you can kind of look up here for what you would do next. An advantage of completing the square is it always works and it gives exact values. The disadvantage is sometimes you end up with messy fractions. When I should use this method? When it's in standard form and it's not factorable. So when it's in standard form, remember standard form looks like this first one here. If it's easily factorable, then I would factor it. If it's not, then you have this as an option. But I would only use completing the square if the x squared term has a coefficient of 1. So here we had a 1x squared. If it has another number, like say this next example where it had a 2 in the front, then I would not use completing the square because you have to divide out a 2. It just makes it more complicated, and the next method is easier. So I only use completing the square when the x squared term has a coefficient of 1. As a matter of fact, I prefer to use the completing the square not only if it's just a 1x squared, but the middle term is even, because then you don't even have any fractions to deal with, and it's pretty easy to complete the square. The last method now that we have talked about that you need to add to your chart is solving with the quadratic formula. So again, this is in standard form, the quadratic formula, and I know you'll be singing it when you write it down, but you have x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Here's an example. So here it is in standard form. Notice that the a is 2, the b is 3, the c is negative 5. So it's the opposite of b, so that's going to make this a negative 3 plus or minus the square root, b squared, so that's 3 times 3 is 9, minus 4 times a is 2 times c is negative 5. Then you do the math. Okay, now this one happens to be a perfect square, the square root of 49. I get 7, so I have to finish the problem. Negative 3 plus 7, which is 4, divided by 4 is 1. Negative 3 minus 7, which is negative 10, divided by 4, which reduces to negative 5 halves. Sometimes you are left with a square root in your answer because it doesn't simplify. So that's the quadratic formula. An advantage is it always works and it gives exact values. A disadvantage is you might have to simplify some square roots. And when I should use this method? When it's in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, you're always allowed to use the quadratic formula because it always works and it always gives you exact values. It will even work on a problem like this, which would have been factorable. I know that because of the types of answers I get. So this would have been factorable. I could have done a modified diamond in a box, but the quadratic formula still works. It will always work. So you have that option to use that. So this chart can kind of help you decide which method would be the best method, and it also gives you some examples. You're going to be able to use this on your quiz, so now you'll have that complete with all the information that you would need.